Good morning. This is a joint meeting of Woodrow Wilson's Africa program and the Global Europe program. What we hope to do this morning is to look at Africa's relationship with the United Kingdom after the UK has left Europe, namely now in Brexit. We have four wonderful scholars to join us this morning, one of whom is only in the audience, but we will draw on her, and two others who are with us. A third, Professor Kadiagala, who is struggling with the internet to join us from South Africa. The purpose of each of these scholars is to address in their distinct field of expertise the impact and ongoing relationships of Africa with the United Kingdom. 16 months ago, at the University of York, a workshop was undertaken to examine Africa beyond Brexit. That has now taken place, and yesterday evening, the European Parliament confirmed Europe's acceptance that the UK had left the European Union. The Prime Minister claims that this is a moment of great opportunity, that Britain is now, as he says, independent and will be able to perform in the international sphere bigger and better. But he also said that members of the Commonwealth were nincompoops flying flags. So we have a contradictory approach to Africa's and more so Boris Johnson's attitude towards the Commonwealth nations. This provides a very intriguing basis on which to start the discussions this morning. And I'm going to ask Professor Julia Gallagher to begin. She is the professor in African politics at the University of London's Oriental and African Studies program, who has written on UK-African relations and currently leads a European Research Council funded project on the architecture and statehood in Africa. Professor Gallagher also serves as a specialist advisor on UK-Africa relations for the House of Lords Committee on International Relations and Defence. She is the author of a wonderful book, Zimbabwe's International Relations, Fantasy, Reality, and the Making of the State. Professor Gallagher, the Zoom room is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for those very kind words. I think I'm going to just sort of start with trying to frame what I'm going to say, which is to say that I'm going to speak really on some of the political and broader sociological work on how Britain has framed its relationship with Africa. And my work is, I suppose, now quite historical. I started off thinking about how this was shaped during Tony Blair's period, but looking back much further back in history to the slave trade, the abolition movement, the colonial period. And now we're really sort of moving it forward to now into the post-Brexit. So I'm going to sort of frame some thoughts within that context. So my backdrop, I think, or the backdrop that I would suggest we start with to recent developments from a British perspective is a persistent popular British framing of Africa as a junior partner or a set of junior partners to Britain. And I don't think that's ever really gone away. There's been a tendency, I think, to see the continent as less political than a moral cause. There's a sort of lazy assumption that you find in Britain that there isn't really any politics that goes on inside Africa, and it tends to come out in the usual tropes that come from aid relief and conflict and so on, much more than in other parts of the world. So with this in mind, I'm going to say something about the three developments that I've been asked to think about: Brexit, is the first one. The second one is the folding of the Department for International Development into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, which has just happened. And then the third one is the integrated review, which was mentioned in the opening comments. And to sort of think, although we don't know, but to think about some of their possible effects on Britain's approach to Africa. And then I think if I've got time, and you'll indulge me, that I'm going to finish with some broader reflections on some of the rather fraught discussions about race relations in the UK that have been playing out and how those might possibly play into UK-Africa relations and conceptions. And that's an area which I'm interested in, but have done no research on. So I'm opening it up as really a question. Perhaps we can have a discussion about it. Okay, so first of all, the 2016 Brexit referendum. So I mean, Africa was not a main player in this debate, but there were a few gestures towards Africa within it. One of them was a kind of vague talk about how cutting back on EU migration, which was a really important factor in the Leave campaign, would or might make space for more Commonwealth migration. And I think this was really framed as an attempt to soothe anxieties that Brexit was motivated by racism. So the idea being, we're not racist, it's not about cutting out people of colour. We actually, you know, this could be a wonderful opportunity to actually increase our migration from Commonwealth countries, many of which, as you know, are African. So that was a kind of a sort of vague hint of an idea that was floating around. And as I say, I think that was more really about a kind of an attempt to to get away from the idea of the accusation that Brexit had a large racist element to it. A second gesture was, and I think this is possibly of more concern to policymakers, was about an increased, or the importance or opportunities for an increased focus on trade with particularly the bigger African players. So the idea that the UK, having left the European Union, would be able to lean more imaginatively, more creatively into bilateral trade relationships, particularly with Kenya, Nigeria and South Africa, the big economies. This was very much part of the idea behind Theresa May, then Prime Minister's visit to Africa in 2018. And the UK Africa Investment Summit in 2020, that was the first one, which was very much played up by the government as being a fantastic place where the UK would show that it would be the partner, the economic partner of choice for African countries. There was a follow-up conference this year in 2021, rather a sort of dip in energy there. Definitely far fewer sort of sense of, or far less of a sense of a kind of excitement about big opportunities. Certainly the pandemic has had an effect on this, an effect on our economy, an effect on many economies. And I think inevitably this was going to be a sort of, not really going to take off in the same way that it presented as having done the year before. But underlying the whole exercise in Brexit, of course, was the idea about making Britain exceptional again, by being independent, not just one of the Europeans, but something that's special and stands out. And I think this carries implicit undertones of returning us to ideas of what we used to be as an imperial nation. This was not defined, but it was a subliminal part of the logic of Brexit. So Brexit was a very sentimental and imprecise campaign. And we might look at what's happened since to see if something more concrete has developed in thinking about Africa post-Brexit. So the first sort of part of that, my second point, is the DFID FCO merger in 2020, and then the aid cuts, which have just been starting to bite more recently. So Africa is key to both because Africa is seen as taking the largest share of development funding, and particularly because it features most strongly in popular imagination of what our Department for International Development was about, and in terms of what our aid budget is for. So the Department for International Development, FCO, Foreign and Commonwealth Office merger was represented as integrating international work. So we're going to sort of clever joined up thinking. But I mean, actually, it really is not is not really. It's about downplaying and cutting back on the development role, and that's confirmed by the recent retreat from the government's long-standing commitment to the 0.7% of national wealth aid commitment, which was considered in Britain to be something which Britain had taken quite a sort of bold international stand on, and it has had a pretty bad reaction among a lot of the political class in Britain. So both the left and the right, people are pretty angry. So some people are angry because they see aid, particularly aid to Africa, as a moral cause, and they think that it's the wrong thing for Britain to be retreating from it. And there are others who see Department for International Development and the 0.7% commitment as one of the UK's best sources of soft power. This was what made Britain stand out from the rest, that actually DFID was seen as taking quite a strong lead in shaping development debates, and the 0.7% was seen as sort of, leading the field, or certainly that's the way that we talked about it to ourselves. And so there's a lot of upset about the way that the government seems to be cutting back on this commitment and cutting back on this role, this sort of soft power, moral leadership kind of role. And people say, why is he doing it? Why is Boris Johnson doing this? Well, actually, it fits extremely well with the Brexit cause. It fits with the Brexit supporting press and voters who don't like the idea of spending money on aid, and they don't particularly like the idea of spending money on Africa. There are lots of sort of very negative stories in the press about vanity projects, or about corruption, or about why are we sending money to other parts of the world when we have poverty in Britain? And I think the Prime Minister thinks that this is not politically costly to him. His support base does not care about aid and development and Africa. So then sort of the third area is the integrated review. So I only read the review recently. Well, it actually came out quite recently, but it's a very macho kind of a document. There's a heavy emphasis on defence and science and technology and strategic interests, which I think play into the Brexit narrative. We're going to be a big boy on the world stage. Perhaps it could be seen as a sort of attempt to flex hard power at the expense of soft power. We're not going to be doing that anymore. So when it comes to Africa, I thought I don't know what to say, really. I mean, there's mention made of bilateral relationships, and there are sort of a handful of African countries that are mentioned. There's much quoted Nigeria, Kenya, Ghana, Ethiopia, South Africa, but there's very little follow through. There's nothing very sort of solid about what this might mean and how it might look different. And in fact, if you look at the way that the trade deals with some of these countries and some of the economic blocs in Africa have been negotiated, actually they're pretty much sort of reproductions, or sort of slightly less good reproductions, of the old EU-based arrangements. So it's difficult to see that there's a real interest in engaging imaginatively with this. Where it is mentioned, Africa is aligned with all the traditional concerns. So, your heart sinks, you get to a sort of paragraph about conflict or terrorism or bad governance or poverty or climate vulnerability, and it's going to be the Africa bits. So to me, there's no sense that the British government is thinking in any way differently from the sort of old tropes of what Africa means. It feels quite unimaginative. So possibly what we're seeing is a kind of weakened down version of the old approach. Now, I don't want to take more than my time, but I'll just sort of very quickly say something about that. I think one of the sort of the context or backdrops to this is that there is quite a nasty debate going on in Britain about how we think about colonial history. We had a really vigorous Rhodes Must Fall campaign. We've had quite a lot of activity over Black Lives Matter protests. We've had quite an uncomfortable discussion in Britain about whether we need to actually think about colonialism differently, whether we might actually teach it in schools, which we don't do, whether we might actually begin to question some of the official narrative about colonialism being largely benevolent or benign. We've got this sort of, some of our museums, some of our quite conservative institutions who are now talking about beginning to look at the legacies of slavery. And there's been a horrible backlash from the right-wing press. there's been an instrumentalization of the sort of cultural war by the government, producing a kind of really entrenched positions between those who are saying nothing about empire can be questioned and those who want to topple all the statues, and sort of, there's very little sort of, seems to me, space in between. And I mean, I sort of have to put my head in my hands when I mention our recent Sewell report on race relations in Britain, which I think just played into this and gave a very complacent, rosy picture of British race relations, dismissing the protesters as misguided youths. So just sort of to finish, I'm actually not entirely sure that in the long run, this might not be a necessary but painful thing, that Africa, in association with all of this discussion about the legacies of colonialism and the race relations which it's produced in this country, has become, I think, more obviously political in Britain. And I just wonder whether it's possible that this might help to enrich or sort of to fill out the kind of image of Africa as a flat moral cause, and have perhaps the potential to actually change the British rather myopic view of Africa. I'll stop there because I think we've got time for more discussion.
Professor Gallagher, you have set out the menu for today by raising migration, colonialism, trade, and the political relationship. I'd now like to turn to Dr. Andrew Chi, who has only recently, that is Monday, left the UK to work now as a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, where he manages the training for the Peace Project and the Africa-Europe Project. But he keeps a tie in London through a senior fellowship at King's College and an associate fellowship at the Royal United Services Institute. He is also, I think with Professor Gallagher, a key contributor to the House of Lords International Relations and Defence Committee report. So both of you, I believe, may have worked together, but Dr. Chi, now that you are out of the UK, not yet back home, but perched in Norway, we'd like to hear from you.
Thank you very much. What I will try and do within my 5 to 7 minutes is try and structure my presentation around 4 key points, which is what is not working. In this case, is the UK's approach to security in Africa, what the UK should not do, what to do, and if we do have time, I will touch on some of the key takeaways, particularly considering that the integrated review was just released last month. And so with that in mind, it's important to say before I start that a lot of the reflections and analysis that I'm about to talk about are really conducted over the last few years from my own engagement with UK officials, military components across Africa, but also it's really seen from a security, conflict resolution and peace building lens. So when it comes to what is not working, I think the UK's position, or there has been confusion over whether the UK's position is a policy between development or developmental aid, poverty reduction, long-term military focus, or more discrete hybrid forms of strategic commercial national interests, such as e-commerce, energy, security, and business for UK companies. But in particular, if you look at the British peace support team's efforts, they are often too short-sighted. They play into the hands of the host states, in this case, the leadership or elites, and it operates from a very narrow British military training initiative, which is efficient in delivering training, but not efficient in delivering sustainable Africa or African democracies long-term. What that means is that some of the support or the support that the UK gives is not effective and cannot be improved, or could be improved by focusing, on activities that enhance the performance of the UN, AU, and REX, or in this case, what we're seeing more recently over the last decade is the emergence of ad hoc security initiatives, which are really between neighboring countries. We see that with the G5 Sahel, the MNTJF, the Multinational Joint Task Force in the Lake Chad Basin, and to some extent, the mission in Somalia as well. While there have been a wide range of activities that the UK has been engaged in Africa, oftentimes, as the previous speaker has mentioned, they lack strategic clarity, which leads to actions that do not directly strengthen the security operations or initiatives in the various different countries. What I mean by this is that oftentimes a lot of these training or activities that are done are focused solely around a particular elite force, or very much short-sighted around counter-terrorism operations, or in some case, or another case, sorry, mostly around hard security, as opposed to a wider stabilization approach. This means that efforts that have not been designed to be self-sufficient, but also do not really consider local institutions and partnering countries, also within partnering countries. This is also, and I would argue, in the climates of or an environment where leverage from the UK side, and we particularly see this in the context of the integrated review, has meant that the leverage that UK has, which sometimes is focused on military, economic, diplomatic approaches, are blunt and to a large extent ineffective at achieving the desired outcome, unless it's in coordination with, for example, the EU, which makes the UK's current position one of weakness. There is also a lack of comprehensive assessment on security and military training provided. So there are no regulatory bodies that the UK reports back to, apart from the MOD headquarters itself. And this means that existing opportunities for leveraging, or in this case, trying to find a solution that is African-led or African-focused, lacks coordination, and there's too much competition between external actors, and also contradictions within Whitehall itself. So when it comes to the UK's approach to security in Sub-Saharan Africa, as the previous speaker has mentioned, the UK still views, I would argue, its security approach through the lens of aid, in terms of what it can get from Africa, instead of thinking why Africa should look to the UK. This is really, I would argue, most of post-Blair, or New Labour's thinking from 2000s, where it was really about aid and conversation, and for really some of the Africa approach or initiatives are, I would argue, compensations for failures that have emerged in Iraq, or interventions that have emerged in Iraq and Libya. And so there isn't, what I would argue, a more comprehensive approach when it comes to Africa, but really Africa, or there's been a lack of understanding, you could argue, from the UK, and particularly from, it would even go one step further, from some civil servants about what Africa actually means in this day and age that we're in now. And so that means that the UK has tried to be everywhere and be really thin, and actually has lacked strategic oversight, but also really long-term thinking in this. Some of the military training, as I've said earlier, has contributed to a large extent creating proxy wars within states, but also between neighboring countries, particularly in the Horn of Africa. And the training and equipment of militaries as a solution oftentimes has gone towards weakening some of these states, because again, the training focuses on the military, or security apparatus has focused more on the military, as opposed to the vast areas of Africa that are oftentimes not necessarily governed in the way that we know of in the Western democracies, but governed in their own ways. And so this has meant that, for example, there is a focus more on CT lens, as opposed to counter insurgency approaches, or what I would argue blended and comprehensive stabilization approaches, which to a large extent, I would argue also adds to radicalizing new potential enemies of the UK, but also damaging the UK's reputation with marginalized ethnic groups or marginalized Islamic groups that exist across the African continent, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa as well. And so what that means is that indirectly, the UK is helping to support the erosion of some states and extension of grievances which are embedded in protracted conflicts, but also enables groups to flourish and capitalize on existing community grievances and weak governance structures. What this means really, and what you can see to a large extent, the UK's approach has meant that what they shouldn't do is really, given the many players that are involved in Africa, they are often still seeing Africa through the lens of rivalry. In this case, what China is doing and China's investment and trying to criticize Africa with engaging with China, or it might be Russia, as opposed to looking at how the UK post-Brexit should engage with African nations, whether it be bilaterally or multilaterally with the African Union or through regional bodies. What this means is that there's a focus, or there tends to be a focus on supporting countries, or lack of focus, sorry, on supporting countries with a long-term contribution to peace operations. Is where the UK could play a role, but this increase in military support means that you have more arms or more proliferation of arms, which contribute to local conflicts, but also prevent local conflict resolutions mechanisms to take place, but also means that you create or recreate new conflicts, oftentimes because you're supporting the elites who then go on to perpetrate the same violence or human rights violations that you are arguing shouldn't take place. But it also means that we could end up in a situation where, particularly with the integrated review and the focus, which hasn't been on a few countries that have been mentioned by the previous speaker, we end up with countries like Uganda and Rwanda, where the UK, particularly through its aid, but also through what it deems as bilateral economic partnerships or trade relations, ends up focusing on propping up leaders who end up staying up and adjusting their constitutional or making constitutional amendments. And in this case, what it doesn't do is help democracy. So what to do, what the UK should be doing, I think it needs to accept that rebuilding weak and collapsed states takes time, particularly in the aftermath of conflict. And oftentimes, even when the FCDO, which was DFID, and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office was separated, there was a lack of focus on, again, the long-term goal, but oftentimes on 2-year, 3-year projects that often lean towards what the UK wanted, as opposed to what African countries or African states wanted. There needs to be consistency, in this case, more focus. The UK needs to look on and focus more on what it is good at, and how it can support stability and continuity, as opposed to focusing on things that it thinks are relevant to Africa. There needs to be more of a shift towards supporting institutional knowledge and knowledge hubs that retain expertise, but also awareness of, example, I would argue, the rule of law, criminal justice, but also resolving existing and ongoing conflicts. There needs to be clear criteria of clarifying the principles of strategic goals for the British peace support team. That is a team that engages with training with the Nigerian troops, but also with Kenyan troops to deal with Al-Shabaab, for example. But it needs to be able to factor in being able to help and support countries to be self-sufficient, to be able to build and support national peacekeeping, regional and also African-led peacekeeping institutions, but also peacekeeping support missions as well, as opposed to just building and focusing on the leadership or the presidential guards, which is oftentimes the problem. And that really leads to my sort of last few points, that the military approaches need to be more than just a hearts and mind campaign. There needs to be more effort to be embedded within society, and there needs to be more effort with engaging with society organizations, not just through aid programs, but also programs that look at how you govern or how you support governance and insecurity in rural areas, but also areas where insurgency groups and jihadist groups might form, because oftentimes that is where there has been, or there is a lack of security, as opposed to focusing solely on the needs and at the center. There needs to be a focus, I would argue, on agile responses to security. So not just hard security, and also being able to adjust agilely to the situation on the ground. And this means that the MOD and the UK Stabilisation Unit, but also the FCDO, needs to think about agile approaches, but also move towards, I would say, an argue of security around policing, how communities can be able to police their own areas. We see good examples in Somaliland that exist, but as opposed to, this, again, as I said earlier, this heavy focus on military means only. And with that in mind, that also means that looking at examples of where the UK has made contributions. So for example, the UK deployed troops to the United Nations mission in South Sudan with engineering capabilities, but hasn't gone on to then use that experience and opportunities and skills that it's required from that mission in other UN missions. What it's done is attracted and then run to areas like the G5 Sahel, which is really about bilateral engagements or support that he wants to get from France post-Brexit. And that really brings me, have I run out of time yet? I'll leave it there and I can come back to the takeaways.
Dr. Chi, you have raised more questions in all of our minds, and I must remind the audience that if they would wish to articulate their question for Dr. Chi, for Professor Gallagher, and for Dr. Kadiagala, who is now with us, please would you email gep@wilsoncenter.org. That is G for George, E for Elephant, P for Patrick, at wilsoncenter.org, or on your Twitter account, tag @WilsonCenter, GEP. I will repeat that later, but for those who, like me, have many questions as a result of Dr. Chi's presentation, please put them on the, send them to us. Now, I am very pleased that Dr. Kadiagala is with us. Welcome. And you as the founder of the Wilson Center's Africa program, we are particularly pleased that you are with us. You are the Jan Smuts Professor of International Relations and Director of the Center for the Study of the United States at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. You have written much, but let me just identify perhaps the most prominent: author of the Regional Cooperation on Democratization and Conflict Management. Other literary works: How Can Democratic Peace Work in South Africa? Trends and Trajectories After the Decade of Hope. To the founding member of the Wilson Center's Africa program, Dr. Kadiagala, the Zoom floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Diana, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I was really privileged to be invited to speak on this occasion, given my previous affiliation with the Woodrow Wilson Center. So it's always good to come back home, and I'm very excited to have been invited here. My comments are going to be very brief, partly because, frankly, I actually don't work on this area as much as I used to when I was a young man. But two, I think the previous two speakers, Julie and Andrew, have given us really a wide spectrum of the kind of details that are critical in understanding UK-Africa relations post-Brexit. And I think they give us a good menu for discussion at the end of my presentation, or at the end of the presentations. What I wanted to do was to cast a wider net in looking at the notion of Commonwealth Africa and the UK. And my first point is to say that historically, this relationship has been on a steady decline. And I attribute the decline of Africa-Commonwealth relations with the UK for two reasons. First, the UK made a decision in the mid-70s to join Europe. And that decision was accompanied by an equally momentous event, the invitation of African countries and the Caribbean and the Pacific countries to begin to negotiate trade and investment agreements with the UK. So I look at that as an important event because the UK was essentially beginning to subcontract some of its Commonwealth responsibilities to Europe. And I think that has been the story since the mid-70s. The other point I want to mention is that historically, the Commonwealth was a very good forum for African countries to put pressure on the United Kingdom to decolonize Southern Africa. And I point to Zimbabwe and I point to Namibia, even the pressures around South Africa leading to majority rule in 1994. But the point I'm trying to put here is that once the African Commonwealth countries succeeded in decolonizing the rest of the continent, the Commonwealth to me became less salient in their lives. And that's why I'm attributing it to not a very new phenomenon of the decline in that relationship. But the other point I'm also mentioning is that the Commonwealth began to lose its attractiveness to most African countries, particularly the real Commonwealth countries. When you have the invitation of countries such as Rwanda, countries such as Mozambique, in fact, becoming part of the Commonwealth. We always thought of the Commonwealth as strictly former British colonies. So I'm attributing the invitation of the Mozambicans under Margaret Thatcher and then of course Rwanda as the beginning to really water down the notion of the Commonwealth. So that's my first set of comments around why there has been a steady decline. The issue around what does it mean anymore? Is it important? Is it relevant? Post-Brexit, this is my second point. I argue that the constituencies, the coalitions within the United Kingdom that pushed for Brexit are precisely the constituencies that do not have a stake in Africa relations or in the rejuvenation of Africa-UK relations. And this has been mentioned from Julia's presentation, and then Andrew reinforces it, that all these discussions around UK first, anti-immigration policies, all these to me are instances of a Britain that has actually lost interest in Africa, or rather lost interest in the Commonwealth as an institution. And I'll come back to that last point I'll come back to that point at the end, where I'll be asking whether in fact we still need the Commonwealth as we know it. So that's those constituencies to me are the most worrying, and we've been alluded to the issues around racism domestically. David Lammy, the member of Parliament, did a good article last week in the Guardian, where he's talking about the Commonwealth war veterans not recognized at all from Africa. So the decline is actually a very important component of British domestic politics. And I like the fact that Julia made the point that those are the constituencies that are actually beginning to ask the bigger question, whether in fact Africa is important. And it's troubling to me in this context where Britain is trying to find a role within the reconstituted Commonwealth, whether in fact it's a good thing to have domestic constituencies that are very, very, very anti-African or anti-Africa. So that's my point. And we can point to already the defeat, the merger, but we can also point to the decline in ODA. And Bill Gates, in fact, complained about this is an abdication of British role in foreign assistance. When you see a big decline from the anticipated, the traditional 0.7 of GDP to 0.2, 0.3. So there's going to be, therefore, there is already a clear view that the UK is really not interested in this aid business. And I think that's the point that came out very clearly in the previous presentations. The third point I want to mention is that there are countries within the Commonwealth, within the African Commonwealth, particularly South Africa and Kenya, Malawi, Nigeria has been mentioned. I think these are countries that have a stake in strengthening relations with the UK. And I'm not convinced that these countries have a larger stake in the Commonwealth as such. I think they have a stake in strengthened relationships, particularly for South Africa, strengthen trade and economic relations with the UK for historical reasons. And I see that as an important element in how the UK is going to reconstitute itself in Africa. It will have to do that through very strategic relationships with these traditional partners like South Africa, like Kenya, like Malawi and Nigeria for economic reasons. And I just saw yesterday there's going to be a summit, UK-Kenya summit on education. And I think these are very creative ways of re-engineering this relationship. If you're going to have an education summit between the UK and Kenya, why do you need the Commonwealth? So that's really I'm looking therefore at the reconstitution of this relationship on the basis of the historical ties between the UK and some of the leading African countries. The other point I want to make is, and it's been alluded to also in the previous discussion, Africa is a very crowded area now. There are so many actors who are converging around Africa. And my skepticism of the UK beginning to reconstitute the Commonwealth as an avenue of competition with these other powers stems from the fact that, in fact, you have the Europeans, you have the Chinese, you have the US. This crowdedness, therefore, complicates the reconstitution of a Commonwealth that is going to function with the same purpose as it was from the beginning. So that's my broader skepticism. So the question, therefore, that I want us to debate is whether, in fact, the Commonwealth is necessary any longer post-Brexit. As I said, African-European ties are much more stronger, and I don't see a lot of Africans trying to recongregate around the Commonwealth, particularly if they really don't see a clear purpose. If there are aid levels are declining, if Commonwealth fellowships are no longer being provided, if the British Council libraries are closed in Kenya or in Malawi, then what will really be the purpose of our Commonwealth? So the point, therefore, I think the UK has an opportunity to rebuild a Commonwealth, but not in the image of a multilateral institution, but in the image of more strategic partnerships with some of its core partners. Having said that, therefore, my skepticism also comes back to the issue. We can still have, or most African countries can still have very strong relations with the UK, I think, without the Commonwealth. And let me stop here. Then go back to you.
Professor Kadiagala, I am so pleased Her Majesty is not on this morning call, because she would be truly saddened to hear your remarks. And I'm not sure whether your knighthood would necessarily be in the New Year's honors list for 2022, but you are a realist and you have seen it over time. I'd like Professor Gallagher to address this point, whether the Commonwealth has become less relevant.
Thank you. I think it certainly has become less interesting in Britain to British people and to British governments. I think it probably actually Godfrey mentioned the way in which the Commonwealth put pressure on decolonisation in Southern Africa. That was a really difficult period for Britain. It didn't make life easy for Britain. Particularly, African members of the Commonwealth, that they really made it difficult. It was an unpleasant, difficult process. That the whole relationship between Britain and Zimbabwe, or Rhodesia as it was, the South African sanctions question, Britain was not, didn't like what was happening, didn't like the pressure coming in the way that it had to sort of reorganize its relationships. And I think the Commonwealth has always been quite tricky for Britain. So it wasn't the club where Britain could somehow have a sort of continuity from the colonial period and be the dominant player in the Commonwealth and sort of organize things in quite the way that it might have fantasized it could. So I think it's always been tricky, and I think it's become less interesting to the British. I suppose the joining of Rwanda and Mozambique is taken to be quite a success and a sort of good thing in Britain. It's almost like it sort of waters down the colonial component, perhaps. I don't know whether that's sort of become problematic, but I think most people feel it's not worth keeping. I think probably it doesn't really seem to sort of serve very much. And I'd be interested to know whether Godfrey thinks it will matter and who it would matter to if the Commonwealth did cease to exist.
Dr. Kariagala, do you wish to answer that now, or can I throw a javelin at Dr. Chi? Can you unmute yourself? Professor Kadiagala, you are muted.
Yeah, I think there are areas that the Commonwealth has always produced the best practices. And I'm talking about even just the DFID experiment in development assistance, the copious knowledge and information about how actually to do foreign aid. And this has been very important in Africa because there have been these conversations between DFID and African authorities on big issues on how to do development. And I think that's something we cannot really ignore. It's going to continue. But the second component is education. I think there are all these solid networks in education. And I just hinted at institutions such as the Commonwealth, Commonwealth scholarships, these kinds of educational exchanges, which are very valued in Africa, are now contested in the UK. But I think if I was grappling for a new area of emphasis, I would say the education arena, the kind of knowledge exchanges I think are important. Again, I think it was mentioned in Andrew's presentation, the UK is still very relevant in some areas of peace and security in Africa, peacekeeping, helping in the stabilization of countries such as Somalia. And even down in now we have a crisis on our hands in Mozambique. The EU has been very much upfront in that conflict. But I can see the UK repositioning itself as a leader around how to deal with the Mozambican insecurity issues, because Mozambique actually is a member of the Commonwealth, as I mentioned from the outset. So there are more areas of engagement. There are more areas of existing engagement in education, in health, in some select peace and security arenas that the UK is still going to play an important role.
Dr. Chi.
Yeah.
Just quickly, 4 points to make on the Commonwealth, because having worked there before as well. I think that one of the key things I would say, there is a younger generation of Africans, and how the Commonwealth itself engages with that is still something that I think it grapples with itself internally. And even when I was there 12, 13 years ago, it was an issue then. So I think this makes a difference. I think there's also the issue of, I think Professor Julia spoke about this earlier, the UK diaspora, the lack of engagement with the diaspora from the UK perspective, and the understanding that the way in which Africa has developed hasn't changed. There is still a mentality, and forgive me for the phrase, British jobs for British workers, and anyone else who is born in the UK who's of a different colour, not seen as particularly of an African descent, is not classed or classified as British. And then I think there's this issue of the relevance in terms of modern technology in online platforms that a lot of African young people are engaging with, that, again, the Commonwealth itself hasn't been able to do as well. Maybe more so in the Caribbean and some Middle East, more Southeast Asian countries, but less so in Africa. And then you have the issue of visas, like in academia and whatnot, and the sort of send people back, which was really coined by Theresa May. So I think in that climate, I think it's hard to see, from my own opinion, and I'm slightly younger than the other speakers, so I just don't see how that's going to happen. But again, let's see. I think there's still room to engage if the UK chooses to.
Dr. Chi, the javelin I wanted to throw to you was in your focus on security and stability. What should Africa itself be doing to strengthen its democracy? We were all so encouraged with this morning's news that Somalia's President Abdullahi Farmajo has agreed to the constitution and will step down. Can we see this elsewhere with African leaders respecting the democracy that they themselves created?
Unfortunately, the trend is in the opposite direction. We see cases in Mali, we are now in Chad, where countries are moving, I would argue, more towards transition agreements, particularly with militaries or constitutional adjustments taking place, which is of a concern. We also see that, unfortunately, there has been a lack of focus on the good governance side of things, but also in this larger framework of stabilization. Some call it stabilization, others call it CT, where again, it's still focused around the military or presidential guards, as opposed to understanding governance and policing and security as part of a long-term sustainable steps. So to conclude, there are some efforts, and I think Africa is trying, particularly, as I said, the younger generation, the African Union. We're seeing more of the regional economic communities or bodies trying to do and shift into this direction. But again, it needs to be sustainable, it needs to be consistent. And I think that's where the UK's role, in particular, supporting the African Union, the regional bodies, will come into play, not just moving away. Again, I'm not one that is against aid, but there has been so much of a focus on aid and poverty reduction itself, which is a good thing, but it doesn't solve the long-term sustainable root causes of conflicts, but also get African countries to be able to do it on their own. And that is key. If Africa's going to be forward, it needs to be able to handle, but also take charge of these situations. And unfortunately, I think to a large extent, some of that focus from the 2000s have diminished Africa's position or its own abilities to be able to do that, because it's meant that governments have been dependent on of international partners to do it.
We have approximately 7 minutes left, so I want to again encourage our audience to send in their questions to gep@wilsoncenter.org or on their Twitter account to tag @WilsonCenter, GEP, all one word, no spaces. Can I raise an issue which Professor Gallagher raised, and which I think that Professor Kadiagala also inferred, which is migration? The integrated review talks of a point-based system. That is a system used by the Australians to increase their population. How might that system work in South Africa, Professor Kadiagala, and perhaps Dr. Chi in Ghana or another country of your choice?
I think the point-based system is a more acceptable method of encouraging migration, because what it does is that it recognizes that there are skills that the UK needs. And these skills are available in places like South Africa or the nurses from Malawi. I mean, the skill-based immigration actually is not very contentious. Also domestically, I think it's easier to sell a policy that says, we have a point system, we're only going to allow in a few doctors, or I don't know, it gets into other debates, but I'm just saying it's a more palatable way of selling migration. I think what troubles Europe and the UK at large, I think, is the question of illegal migration, the phenomenon of the Mediterranean. I mean, the people crossing across the Mediterranean to go to Europe. But the point systems have always been embedded in all these policies around, we're going to encourage, we're going to have visas for specific people. The Canadians have always done it, and I think it works. It works.
Dr. Chi, how do you view a point-based system of immigration?
I think, from my perspective, I think to some extent it is good, as Professor Gilbert has mentioned. But I think that the issue that or concern I have is that it then means that all of the effort that has gone into partially trying to build some of the capacity of African countries, it means that you draw the very same people that you've spent time skilling up or putting efforts into, and you pull them way back into the UK. We see that with nursing, particularly in Ghana, where a lot of Ghanaian nurses, where I'm from, will go and apply to the UK or other places like Philippines, where you pull the resources of a state or from resources from where people are, where systems are weak or trying to be built, and you put them into your own system, which doesn't, again, long term doesn't help the countries itself. So really, it's about, is this producing a vicious cycle here? And I suspect to a degree it probably will do, but it's still early days to see. But I think as Professor Gilbert has mentioned, a lot of this is still through the lens of that sort of British jobs for British workers phrase, but also how we protect ours. They're understanding that a lot of young people or middle-aged people my age don't really understand that Britain was built off an empire, and that there is exchange of migration that is healthy, but also how do you do it that is fair? And I don't think the point-based system is fully fair yet, because again, it has its repercussions. Just like the issues of climate and security, where you have a lot of Western states who want to have greener economies and whatnot, but actually forget where the raw materials are coming from and what conflicts it produces locally on the ground. So it's always that in the back of my mind.
That leads us to a question which we have in the last 3 minutes from Ambassador Hank Cohen, who is probably one of our most informed senior officials, now retired, on Africa, who asks, are UK companies investing in Africa to take advantage of the All Africa Free Trade Agreement? Would one of you like to answer that?
I think let me start by just saying the Africa Free Trade Area is still a work in progress. It's just been inaugurated this year, and the bricks and mortars are being put in place. I suspect that the UK, for now, I think the UK has other issues that is dealing with rather than finding new markets. My point is that I think the UK companies that are already here are probably positioning themselves to take advantage of the free trade area once it gets off the ground. But I'm not sure whether there are, in fact, any new UK companies that are strategically addressing the Africa trade area. I rather think about existing ones, the ones that already have their footing in Africa.
Professor Gallagher, as we reach the end, would you like to say a few words about the trade area as opposed to the aid?
Yes, I mean, I think that the COVID pandemic situation has really dampened possibilities quite dramatically, and I think that's, I mean, certainly in terms of expanding markets or trade opportunities anywhere, but certainly in Africa, I think that's going to be really very badly affected for quite a long time, I suspect. I just wanted to say that one of the things I think, I mean, I actually do think that moving towards trade and sort of thinking about trade more than aid is a positive thing, because I think there's something about a sort of a reciprocity that is potentially there, which I think is more healthy but I think I might feel quite gloomy about it at the moment, given the current economic situation.
Are there any last comments that Dr. Chi would like to make? And then I will ask Professor Kariagala as we reach our 1 hour mark. Dr. Chi.
Just, I think quickly, I think quick takeaways. It's really about direction, having a clear diplomatic and military strategy about how the UK approaches Africa, which needs to be multi-dimensional in its support. It needs to be focused. It needs to move away from just reaction to prevention. It needs to be sustainable in its approach to Africa, but also, I think, which is more important, it needs to know the African context, and that has been lacking for a very long time, unfortunately.
Thank you, Dr. Chi. Professor Kariagala.
I just wanted to address an issue that was raised earlier on brain drain, and I really take the point that it's a problem in the short term, but the long term ways of dealing with brain drain is actually for African countries to be investing in these doctors and nurses to provide the kind of environment where they can thrive. But the brain drain only comes in because there's an exit option and the systems here are not working. So why would a nurse, well-trained nurse, if she has an opportunity to go to England, why would she be in Malawi? It's up to the Malawian government to provide those opportunities. So, and I also think remittances are a good part of the migration. And in the short term, I think they alleviate a big problem for most of these African families that are sending their kids off to the UK.
It's been wonderful discussing with each of you, and I would like us to continue for longer. But the Zoom time has elapsed, and I want to say thank you to each of you for your contributions. I hope we can stay in touch. Dr. Kariagala, you have formed a wonderful program in the Africa program, and Dan Hamilton, who's on the call, you create and continue the Global Europe program. Thank you to each of you, and in particular, thank you to two very special people, Treyon Burgess and Tracy Fitzgerald, who have kept us online, but may take us down before I say, toodaloo, bye-bye, thank you.
Bye.